Well, as Renee admits, people that are coming just a little bit late, we wanted to just do a few housekeeping items before getting to our main event today. Welcome everybody to another edition of the monthly Corgoning webinar. The first thing I promised to do is it still screen sharing, Renee?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so every 3 years, there is, I think going back to the 1970s, there's been a tradition for Corgoning scientists, Europe, from Eurasia and North America to come together. And this would be the 15th symposium. It's every 3 years typically, and I think it in general has been 2 years in sort of Europe or Asia, 1 year on North America. North Americans hosted it in 2017, I believe, in Bayfield, Wisconsin. Some of you may have been able to attend that. Organized by Jared Myers and many others. And this year's edition is in Evian, France, and it is coming up. The deadline for abstracts, I believe, is, maybe it's on the next slide here. Yeah, there you go. So early bird registration ends on May 15th. And that includes abstract submissions. And Orlan Anvil, who has actually given one of our Corgoning talks previously, mentioned that they didn't have a lot of registrants so far from North America. So I know it's expensive to get there, and but if you do have an interest or would like to learn more about this, please feel free to reach out, and I'm happy to give you any more information I can. It's going to be a wonderful setting, I think. The way these work, they're essentially, it's different from most meetings where you might have to run from this room to that room to this room. Everybody hears the same talks. It's which I think is kind of unusual, and they're organized by theme, and each theme essentially has a, I don't know, half-hour sort of plenary talk to try to kick them off. So you can see those different themes from the Monday to the Friday and the people that will kick off those themes. I think the 5th theme will be a day you don't want to come to. He will not do a good job there on stock assessment, fishery management, etc. But the other ones are going to be great. So come for those. I think that's all I wanted to share with that, Renee. Did you want to talk about next month's webinar at all?
We have next month, we have Kelly Hoyer from CNU coming to talk about larval whitefish and cisco interactions. And I will drop in the chat the registration for next month. You can get that going.
Okay, thanks for that, Renee. And I don't know if we have Kelly on or not to, I haven't seen her participate.
I don't see her.
Okay. All right. So with that, I'm really pleased to introduce Alex Duncan for our webinar today. Alex, got to know Alex when he was doing his master's work through Lakehead University. And you're going to hear about that work today during this webinar, at least in part. Alex grew up on the Bruce Peninsula there, on Lake Huron, nearby Lake Huron. He's from the Chippewas of Nawash, Unceded First Nation. And since he completed his master's degree, he is now out at the University of British Columbia, where he's working on his PhD with Andrea Reed. And I don't know why I didn't know this, but now I do. And I'm really pleased to know that he's continuing to do Great Lakes work there. So he's looking at sea lamprey and indigenous knowledge. So that's just awesome that he's continuing to be involved in the Great Lakes work. But today he's talking to us about cisco, not sea lamprey. And so, Alex, can you share your screen there? He tells me that his talk is 20 minutes or so, and we hope that you all will stay on and have a great discussion, questions, as we have done in the past. But yeah, it looks good. See the full screen, and I'm going to go on mute and welcome to Alex. Thanks very much.
Right on, sweet. Thanks, Miigwech, Bo. Yeah, happy to be here. I have a soft spot for ciscoes, of course. But yeah, I'm here to talk about my master's research, like Bo had mentioned. Yeah, I'm excited to be here. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to come and talk. As Bo mentioned, I'm a PhD student here at UBC, a long ways from the Great Lakes, but it's hard to get away from the Great Lakes. I'm joining from campus today, which is situated on the Musqueam territory here at Point Grey. So I'll just hop right in. My slides work here. Joining from Vancouver, it's always nice to situate myself back in the Great Lakes. I have this wonderful illustration from Nicole Marie Burton, and it helps me get into the right mind space. I think it's a different interpretation of the Great Lakes. It's flipped on its side with east at the top. I haven't received the teaching as to why this is more in line with Indigenous or Anishinaabe thinking, but I would guess that it has to do with the rising and the setting of the sun. So I just wanted to share that image and then zoom into the Saugeen Ojibway Nation. The Saugeen Ojibway Nation, or as I'll be referring to it, the San is a collective nation on the Bruce or Saugeen Peninsula. It's composed of two sister First Nation, the Chippewas of Nawash, Unceded First Nation, where I'm a member, and the Chippewas of Saugeen First Nation. Together, they govern this quite expansive traditional territory collaboratively through a joint council. The archaeological record dates back several thousands of years, and it marks continued residence of this area and use of this area. I mentioned that the traditional territory is quite expansive. It's the darker area there. And through a series of treaties, we ceded a significant portion of that territory. And now we are currently residing on those two reserves, and there's a couple other reserve lands in that territory. Here's just a video of part of the Bruce Peninsula. This is just north of Tobermory at the tip of the peninsula. We have the Niagara Escarpment run through the peninsula, and at least one side of the peninsula, the eastern side, is characterized by these large limestone rocks, limestone cliffs, and the western side, where Saugeen is situated, it's more swampy and sandy. It's lovely. I'm very thankful to call this place home, and I will be returning this summer for field work. Given that expansive territory and such immediate access to water, it makes sense that fish have been integral to the Saugeen Ojibway Nation. We've been fishing for quite some time, and fishing continues to be a very important component of our way of life. Many families have fish harvesters in them. I know certainly there's several in mine. So it's very important to us. I'm gonna give a brief background to the Saugeen Ojibway Nation and our history with respect to fishing. I think it sets the stage nicely, and it's a nice learning opportunity. This first era, pre and post contact, is fairly important. By contact, I mean contact with European settlers. Prior to contact, we, as I mentioned, we're quite embedded in our fishery. We fished using a variety of methods: spearing, nets, hooks, etc. And that fishing operation supported a very extensive trade network with other nations across the Great Lakes and beyond. Following contact, we entered into a number of good faith arrangements with the settlers that were beginning to show up on the territory. We leased out several areas for fishing. However, as more settlers settled the area, encroachment and abuse of those good faith arrangements became more commonplace. Fast forward, colonial and later Canadian legislation served as a way to restrict our access to the fishery. Through some legislation, we were forced into what we call postage stamp fisheries. So just an area of allowable fishing, harvesting around each reserve. And in addition, there was an imposed communal quota. And that was difficult for our people, being restricted from our territory in that way. This all sort of came to a head in the 90s. Prior to the 90s, several fish harvesters were being charged for fishing outside of those boundaries or over harvesting, going over the imposed communal quota. In 1993, an individual fought one of those charges, and it went to the Ontario court. Through that court process, they were acquitted, and our rights to harvest fish for food and fish commercially were reaffirmed based on historical precedent. It was a very interesting time. They call that the Fairgrave decision, and after that, the province of Ontario began buying back all of the non-native quotas in the area and returning them to the Saugeen. Some years had passed, and then we began discussions with the province and entered in a series of fishing agreements, which have continued to this day. But that pre-2000 era was a difficult time. Once we received or had our rights reaffirmed, there was a lot of conflict between different user groups and a lot of concerns from recreational anglers and cottagers and the like. It was a very tumultuous time. I was just a child, so I don't remember that, but I've heard several stories. Through that whole process, the fisheries assessment program was created to support the commercial fishery and just the fishery in general. Aside from commercial fishing, we have, of course, recreational fishing and fishing for food. I had worked for this fisheries assessment program since high school, so I've become quite familiar with it. And more recently, I guess I would say we've been involved in a lot of research, which I will talk to in a bit. So just a bit about the commercial fishery. I mentioned we had our rights reaffirmed in 1993 and then began right away operating our commercial fishery. Target a number of fish species, most prominent being lake whitefish and lake trout. What I'll talk to in a bit is deep water ciscoes or chub and shallow water cisco lake herring. Those were also important, chub being more commercially important than lake herring. We operate two different types of commercial fishing vessels, Lake Erie style tugs and open punts like the Trump there in the middle. The main gear is just gill nets, typically bottom set. That's all in well, but there are several issues with our commercial fishery. There's a lack of youth entering the fishery. And of course, there's several ecological problems in the Great Lakes, which have been affecting our fish harvesters. And here we come to the third era, I guess the era that we're in right now, research, outreach, and learning together. Joint Council had mandated the importance of research and in particular education, not just for our communities, but for the wider community in the Bruce Peninsula. We've come across some issues of inclusion and access to certain decision-making tables within the Great Lakes. And we have seen and used research as a way to sort of address those issues and make our case, I suppose. The last point there, I have a bit about two-eyed seeing. My Cisco research wasn't technically two-eyed seeing. It was something we had discovered along the way. And what two-eyed seeing is essentially this idea of using both Indigenous knowledge and Western science together. With two different perspectives, you certainly have an opportunity to learn more than you would with just one. So it's nice, and we've been using it quite a bit since then, and it's led to a number of research collaborations with government, academia, and management agencies. This is a cool wheel that I believe Caitlin Almack from Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry and Ontario had made in collaboration with us. But this is just, I suppose, a basis for any research that we engage in. That this research is place-based and issue-focused, informed by the Saugeen community. It recognizes multiple ways of knowing. So that's, indigenous knowledge and Western science. Any research we enter into, we have to have shared and meaningful goals. It has to be mutually beneficial and equitable, and there has to be an educational component as well. So I just wanted to share that. Now on to the ciscoes piece. This is my master's research. Very grateful to have had this opportunity. I mentioned lake herring and chub were important to the Saugeen. So lake herring were more so a traditionally important food fish. We operated an inshore fishery prior to contact and likely following contact for some time. It's highly unlikely we were catching chub just based on I guess technology and the boats we were using. But once we had our rights reaffirmed and we began to engage in a commercial fishery, we were able to target deeper waters with tugs, and begin harvesting chub. As Anishinaabe people, we have an ethical and cultural responsibility to care for all living things. In Anishinaabe thought, we are connected to all living beings as kin. We have a Dodem system or clan system. Whitefish is one of our clans, and it's a very close connection, closer than just, I suppose, a regular connection to animals as kin. With that comes the responsibility to care for them. And in a lot of depictions of, I guess, the wild or animals, humans are seen as superior. However, for Anishinaabe, we are seen as equals, and oftentimes animals or fish or what have you are viewed as teachers, whereas humans have something to learn from these beings. They're native species, so we've been in the territory for several thousands of years, and so have these fish. So there's that connection. And more recently, there's been a concern from the Saugeen Ojibway Nation community about ciscoes. Lake herring, while once an important traditional food fish and is still an important food fish, isn't really in the commercial fishery. They're not a fish that's targeted that much. And I think I'll talk about this in a bit, but that's due to a poor market value compared to other fish like whitefish or lake trout. And then chub were super important for our commercial fishery when it started in the 90s, but by the late 2000s, our fish harvesters could no longer catch chub of a marketable size. So that fishery completely stopped, and no one has fished for them since then. So given those two reasons, not seeing either really in the commercial fishery, our community was concerned, and that's what prompted this investigation into the knowledge of our fish harvesters who had interacted with ciscoes in the past. There was a lot of people involved in this project, but most prominently, I'd like to recognize Lakehead University, where I did my master's, Parks Canada, which we're a super awesome partner and contributed funds to this project, and the Saugeen Ojibway Nation fisheries assessment programs. So what we did is we wanted to learn from Saugeen fish harvesters about their experiences and I suppose temporal and spatial knowledge with respect to ciscoes in the territory. To do that, we decided to engage in some mapping interviews. We borrowed quite heavily from this fellow Terry Tobias, who does a lot of traditional land use and occupancy mapping and map biographies. We had altered his approach a little bit to suit the needs of this specific project, but it worked out quite well. Myself and typically a youth from the community sat down with 19 past and present fish harvesters, commercial fish harvesters, and asked them a series of questions and mapped a number of features on the map. As you can see, those maps were pretty big, and we got a lot of pretty interesting information. The questions we asked were informed by the community and discussions with the fisheries assessment program and SON leadership. Yeah, it was quite surreal. There's a lot of information there, and we're only specifically asking about ciscoes. I'm sure, like the SON right now, they're doing quite a large research project on lake whitefish, taking a similar approach. But there's a lot to be gleaned from this type of inquiry, I believe. I'm not going to read all of these quotes. These are just some of the quotes that came up. There were several themes. My master's thesis goes over the themes in more detail, and there's a paper to be published soon that is a little shorter than my master's thesis, but essentially for a lot of fish harvesters, chub were very prominent and seemingly abundant, you know, in the mid to late 90s and early 2000s. They were a central component of our commercial fishery, which is wild to think, given that they're not harvested anymore. Some of the quotes, one that sticks out is that second one: "I never really targeted whitefish because I was making it so good on chub." For me, that's surprising, given the prominence of whitefish in the commercial fishery today. And then that second last one: "You ask any kid in the community here, they don't know what a chub is. The chub have been gone for so long that people don't talk about them anymore. They don't remember them anymore." So yeah, it shows that there was quite a significant decline of these marketable sized chub in that time period. A lot of reasons were given to the decline of these larger chub. Our communities, both Nawash and Saugeen, are quite opposed to the stocking of non-native species of fish, specific salmonids, like the several different salmon species and some trout species. They were cited quite often in the interviews as being a cause of the decline of these fish. Zebra mussels also were cited quite often, and the changing clarity of the water. I specifically like this last quote. And in the end, you know, Aboriginal people always said our ancestors fished this fish since time immemorial. What that refers to is the native species of fish. If the fish changes, are we going to be able to say that about the salmon? They're changing who we are without even talking to us. They're impacting on our Aboriginal and treaty right. They're changing our culture and our heritage indifferent if it was somebody else. I think that's an interesting quote. Yeah, I'll just continue on. So for the shallow water cisco, for the cisco or lake herring, as we call them, there was a lot of discussion about no one harvesting herring for quite some time. I mentioned their market value is quite low, so for our commercial fish harvesters, it doesn't really make sense to put much effort into harvesting them. Which is interesting, because elsewhere in the Great Lakes, there's a lot of lake herring harvesting. Anyways, but yeah, another thing that came up a lot in the discussions about lake herring was an increase in abundance within the last decade or so. Now, even though our fish harvesters aren't targeting lake herring specifically, they do get caught as bycatch and like whitefish harvests quite often, especially during spawning season. Their spawning times are very close on that, especially on the western side of the peninsula. So yeah, that's reassuring to see and hear that you know, they're catching a lot more lake herring than they used to. So those are just some of the quotes. I tried to keep them relatively short and tied specifically to either lake herring or chub. Of course, we talked about a great many other things, but I mean, for the sake of time. I'll just leave it at that. And then in addition to those lovely quotes and the transcripts that we produced, we got a lot of spatial information. So this is one of the aggregate maps from all 19 participants. I'll just briefly explain what we're looking at here. The blue polygons, dots, and lines without arrows are past harvest events. So those are areas in which fish harvesters identified they had harvested chub. The blue lines with arrows are indications of chub movement. And then the same for lake herring harvest. However, there's no arrows, green arrows. As you can see, there's quite an abundance of spatial information. And the nice thing that I like about this is that for each feature, polygon, point, line, there's a specific reflection or a story that goes along with it. So it's a lot more than just a map. There's a lot of embedded information within, and this just gives us a glimpse. Each feature also has a temporal element. So when they were coded into the map, they have what type of what season it was when this harvesting took place. If the fish harvesters could remember specifically. And yeah, super cool. With this spatial information, we wanted to sample chub and lake herring. We began with lake herring. I mentioned that they're caught as bycatch quite often. So in November 2019, we were able to get some lake herring that were bycatch in the commercial harvesting operations. They were quite large, and it was awesome to see. And then we went sampling for chub. We had to take a different approach for chub. They're not often caught as bycatch. So we had to hire fish harvesters within the community, all of which were participants in the interviews, and we went out with them to set some nets and look for chub. We were successful in finding chub. However, they were a lot smaller than those chub that they were catching back at the height of the commercial fishery. These were not marketable size. They were quite small and likely bloaters. But either way, it was pretty surreal to be on the boats. A lot of these fish harvesters hadn't seen a chub in about 15 or 10 years. So they're quite pleased to see them, even if they could no longer support commercial fishery. There's just a picture. I got to go out on the boats. It was lots of fun, really cool. But it was cold. We did that in November and December, so very cold, and the conditions were not very pleasant. Here's just a close-up of where we got the lake herring from. The 3 points there. I believe A, there was two sets there, and B, the collection we had was very small. And then here's just the chub sample sites with 3 different locations, and in each location, two sets. This is all in the paper that's forthcoming. I think it's available online right now, with a similar title to this talk, and me as the lead author with Kevin Harper from Parks Canada and Ryan Lozon from Nawash Fisheries. This is the stuff that we caught. We had initially planned on doing a 12-hour or 24-hour set, but upon going out there, the fish harvesters, well, the first one, he's like, we should not be setting these nets for that long. They were fairly small mesh and a range of different mesh sizes, and he was concerned that we would just become inundated with fish and unfortunately have to kill them all, or they would die upon lifting the nets. The depths ranged anywhere from 200 to 400 feet, I believe, at the deepest. And yeah, once we collected all of those fish, we were invited down to Ann Arbor to learn how to measure meuristics and morphometrics for the lake herring specifically. Randy Eschenroder was interested, and what we had measured contributed to a paper that I think came out last year. I believe, which had shown the lake herring we collected was a unique form of Coregonus artidae, which in that paper was called the short-head cisco of the Western Bruce Peninsula. So that was interesting. And yeah, that's my talk. Some final reflections. I think these types of interviews or these types of inquiries are really important. And I mean, there's a lot of information there. I only showed just a tiny sliver. Each interview was anywhere from, an hour to 3 hours. And we got a lot of good data, and knowledge and understanding. And this initiative is being carried forward, like I mentioned, with Lake Whitefish. And I think it stands to serve the Great Lakes, ultimately, the entire Great Lakes, if these sorts of initiatives were taking place across different tribes and First Nations on both sides of the border. Anyways, that's my talk, Miigwech, and I'd be happy to field any questions.
All right. Thank you very much. It's hard to do applause in the virtual era, but some people might have their ability to do that with their reactions there. Yeah. So, yeah, I'll kick us off, Alex. I'm really interested to learn more about sort of the movement sort of maps, especially with the movement documents for the chubs. Do you recall how they were making those inferences about chub movements sort of within those regions? And
yeah, so most individuals had mentioned that they travel north and either go around the peninsula or stay in their respective basin. But I mean, like they were going out every day to harvest them, or mostly every day, right? So I think they got a pretty good beat on where these fish were going. But yeah, they were mostly like north and south movements. There was a few that were east to west, but yeah.
okay, so that's just based on sort of where they were following them for the fishery, I guess.
Yes, yeah.
Okay. And then kind of related, so those are probably, as you said, bloater, or Randy believes they're different than sort of historically, morphologically than bloater. But in Lake Ontario, there's an effort to bring back the bloater. And so there's, for now, almost 10 years, they've been stocking bloater from Lake Michigan into Lake Ontario. And they've had some recaptures, but Lake Ontario has degraded habitat near shore and maybe even offshore. So one of the things they've asked us that are studying bloater in Lakes Michigan or Lake Huron is, where do they spawn? And so we don't study them really during their spawning period, because it's January, peaking in February. Our boats are tied up. So it's really the fishers that are out collecting bloater. And I wonder if some of the Saugeen fishermen, through their own knowledge, if they were executing the fishery back in the 90s, I wonder if they might still have some knowledge about chubs and how they spawn, how they reproduce.
Yeah, that certainly came up in the interviews. I didn't include any of it here. And I think I do in my thesis, but yeah, it's interesting because I would assume that they've harvested several different forms of deep water cisco, right? So a lot of the accounts of spawning and timing and whatnot were sometimes conflicting. There was some general consensus, and I haven't been looked at my thesis in a while, but I think there was at least some consensus on like when they were spawning and what sorts of conditions. When we sampled, it was always muddy bottom, and some of the bloaters or whatever type of deep water ciscoes those were, they were gravid at the time, so they were pretty close. And this was late November, early December.
Yeah,
in those areas. But yeah.
All right, well, you've given me reason to go look at your thesis and see what you said about that, so. So others, if you have questions, feel free to flip on your camera, feel free to type them in the chat. Raise your hand if you like, or just putting your camera on could also be a sign. I'll ask
Okay,
one.
thank you, Alex. I think I liked a lot of those quotes you had from the thon fishermen. They were very thought-provoking.
Yeah, it's difficult to select only such a few. I admittedly cherry-picked them from my thesis when I was making this slide deck. But yeah, as I mentioned, we have like 19 transcripts from 1 to 3 hour interviews, and there's a lot of cool stuff. And not only specific to Cisco. I mean, they talked, you get some people talking and they tend to rabble on and talk about super unrelated things, but I guess somewhat related in the sphere of fisheries. So yeah, it was cool. I like this type of research.
Did you conduct all of those interviews yourself, or did you have help with that?
Yeah, mostly myself. We did have in the summer, I don't know, I think it was 2019. We did have a high school summer student at the office, and they did hop in for some interviews.
I think
Right.
Ralph has his hand up.
Yeah.
Hey, Alex. Thanks for that talk. Really interesting stuff. I was curious, you mentioned about herring and just the fact that there isn't this value for collection. They're often bycatch. I'm just wondering, as things expand, I mean, I think there was a quote about catching 6 or 7 boxes now versus 1 20 years ago. Do you have any insight from those interviews on whether there is an expanding interest or value, or is it simply that if there's no market or no interest in the community, then that's it?
Yeah, thanks for the question. There is interest. It's just like these commercial fish harvesters have to make money, right? And it's expensive to operate and own a tug. Yeah, it would be nice if there was a market for them, you know, and like I'm sure in Toronto, like Toronto is a 3 hour drive southeast from us. I'm sure there's some market there, but it's just difficult to get out there with fresh fish sometimes. I would love to see a lake herring market. I'm a big fan. When I lived in Thunder Bay, they had tons of smoked lake herring, so that was always a pleasant treat. But yeah.
Yeah, I can understand that. Thank you. Appreciate it.
We have a shy group today, it seems like. I mean, another sort of market that I know that's been popular in Lake Superior for lake herring are the roe. And I think a lot of that market actually is maybe not even in North America. I don't know if anybody here from on the front is from Lake Superior. They could sort of talk about the dynamics of the market in Lake Superior.
I know, just before, if anyone would speak up, one individual had mentioned that when they began commercial fish harvesting, there was a lot of knowledge sharing between like the non-native fish harvesters who operated in the area, and after the quota was bought out, there was a nice learning relationship there. And one individual said that he was taught by a fellow to harvest lake herring for their roe. And he did sell that for a time, but that was in the 90s.
Don, so he popped on there. He might be able to talk about Lake Superior.
Well, yeah, you know, in Minnesota and Wisconsin and in Ontario too, they're harvesting cisco for the roe market. Most of that roe market ends up in the Baltic area of Europe. So it's you know, the Norway, Sweden especially seem to be hot on the roe market, and unfortunately they crashed their stocks in the Baltic. So I'd be a little bit cautious about getting into the roe market on Lake Huron because those stocks are just starting to come back. At least that's my perception. And once you open up a roe market, it's pretty lucrative and it's really hard to pull back on it. The other thing I'd suggest is if you do start opening up that sort of fishery, before you open it, work on developing total allowable catch models so you don't end up over harvesting the fish from the get-go. And, you know, we kind of learned our lesson here in Lake Superior. Most of the agencies now have some sort of model that they use to allocate harvest. So I think that's would be a really good approach and a conservative approach, especially when you're trying to reestablish stocks like is going on in Huron.
Thanks, Don. That makes sense. There's a few in the chat, Alex. First from Paris Schofield. I don't know if you can see it there. Miigwech, thank you for sharing your thesis findings. How would you, so you talked about that your thesis was not quite two-eyed. So how would you promote two-eyed seeing in future research? And are there resources you know that folks that might be interested in learning more about two-eyed seeing that you could lead them to?
Yeah, I'll plop a paper in the chat. There's a really good one by my supervisor, Andrea, that talks just about two-eyed seeing. How would I promote it? There's also a special issue coming out in the Journal of Great Lakes Research in July, I believe, with a lot of this sort of stuff. I mean, I guess I would just promote it verbally in any way I can. I think it's a good way to engage in research with Indigenous communities. A lot of times in the past, a lot of helicopter science folks coming into communities and with their own questions, answering those questions, and then leaving without any real tangible benefit. But when you engage in this two-eyed seeing ideas, it helps level the playing field and make it a little more equal. I think there's a want and a need for this type of work. There's very few examples of two-eyed seeing, I'd say, in the Great Lakes. Specific to two-eyed seeing, I'm sure there's lots of collaborations, and there is a lot of collaborations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous groups. But yeah, I would say keep an eye out for that Journal of Great Lakes Research special issue that's forthcoming, and then that Reed paper does a good job of explaining two-eyed seeing and its use in fisheries management. See another question from Peggy there. Suppose I could just read it and answer it. Can you talk about how the sample sites were selected and if there were others considered and the reasons why they weren't chosen? Yeah, so we had that big aggregate map from all 19 participants, and we essentially sat down with our fisheries committee, fisheries program, and spoke with some fish harvesters about the places they were most interested in. Some of the areas had several features. And some were referenced by older fish harvesters and newer fish harvesters. There were several factors, and ultimately, like, it came down to like the day of and conditions and what made the most sense to go. And I mean, we were successful at all 3 sites for chub. For the lake herring, it was just basically wherever the fish harvesters were looking for whitefish around spawning season. Yeah.
So Amy Cottrell dropped in. As you see, another good case study that she's suggesting. Now the link. And Titus Selheimer also has a comment there. I think it's more of a comment and not a question. Is that right, Titus?
Yeah, just a kind of a comment on what Don said about roe, because we're right in the middle of trying to communicate to Europe that, you know, that our fisheries do have, you know, they're managed, and so before you jump into a roe fishery, if that export goes away, there's not going to be a roe fishery. So.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I did say there is interest. I find it highly unlikely that we're gonna try and start up a lake herring fishery roe or for anything really. We've faced a lot of challenges. Our commercial fisheries shrunk quite a bit within the last 5 or 10 years. There's not a lot of commercial fish harvesters out there these days.
More activity in the chat. Renee dropping in webinar series being put on by USGS, Climate Adaptation Centers, and Aaron Dunlop. So Aaron, or Alex, Aaron is saying this is an example of two-eyed seeing that you were involved with.
Yeah, I don't know if Erin wants to talk about it. She's on that as well.
Oh, well, I mean, you you can probably do it just as well, but you know, Alex's work that he started was a real, I don't know, inspiration, I think, for a lot of us for doing this kind of two-eyed seeing work. And so I think Alex's study, his master's, kind of really I don't know, paved the way for us to do like some further work on this. Alex kind of mentioned it already, but we're doing some two-eyed seeing work related to lake whitefish in Lake Huron. So with that project, so in that paper that I linked there, we kind of go through the early steps of kind of developing the project and kind of discuss what the project's about. But I think what was really key in that, what we highlight in that paper, is just how it was the two-eyed seeing approach that kind of really allowed M&R and SON to kind of come together and work on a research study together. You know, Alex went over a little bit of the history there with the province. You know, the relationship hasn't always been a very good one or a very productive one. So with the two-eyed seeing work, it really was an opportunity for us to kind of come together and address some of the changes in the lake and what was happening with lake whitefish. So yeah.
Thanks for that, Aaron. And that's also in this special issue, or but
Yeah.
it's already online now. But the in-print issue will be coming out later then.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I just blocked it in the chat there. Yeah, it's been awesome. Like doing research in this way has helped, as Aaron mentioned, helped rebuild that relationship. And it's been super cool to be a part of. Very thankful.
And we actually have a little documentary, well, I don't know if it's a little, but a documentary coming out at some point in the next couple of months, actually, that also discusses that project. So just give a plug for that one to look out for. Alex is in it.
Plugs are welcome here. Yeah. So Alex, with the chubs, you mentioned that some of the interviewers talked about, well, it's clear that the size of chubs no longer really is marketable enough for a fishery. I mean, they barely get over 200 millimeters now in Lake Huron, and that was not the case, and something really did change. And so your interviewees indicated that was salmon. I think I heard you also say mussels and increasing water clarity. Were those the primary sorts of explanations?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like that is something that we could try to figure out, like maybe using a two-eyed approach, like what is it that has caused this change? Because we don't see that on the other side in Lake Michigan. They do grow more slowly. They don't maybe attain the same maximum size they used to, but not nearly to the extent as the wall they appear to hit from a sort of a maximum size as they do in Lake Huron. So whether that's a productivity issue or something something else we don't understand. I know that's a concern more broadly than just with the SON fisheries. So any other questions out there? Okay. Well, Alex, thanks for joining early in the morning out there in British Columbia, Vancouver. And we had, I think I saw nearly 60 people online. So your talk drew interest. And we look forward to many of you returning next month, hearing about interactions at the larval stage between Lake Whitefish and cisco, given by Kelly Hoyer. So thanks again, everybody. Have a great weekend.